Okay, second last lecture block for the summer term 2020. One question that we have to ask ourselves is, now that we know how neural networks learn actually and what we would like to achieve in terms of knowledge and simple semantics, simple meanings, is how do we actually become what we are? That is, how do we actually learn as human beings? Well, there are different levels on which we can learn knowledge. And now, in a very brief introduction, I would like to give you an outline of what all counts here. Of course, apparently, one important starting point is human evolution. When it's about evolution, then it's about the growing brain. What we can see is that by sheer extent, the brain has become bigger during evolution, that new functionalities were growing towards the cortex, and that the connections in the cortex have become more denser. So these are three aspects that cannot be denied. Apparently, with that we developed the ability to do better communication. More sophistication, I would say. An interest in culture, in complex social behavior, and also, I would say, a more in consciousness. It has to be admitted that we know only little about the consciousness of animals, and some of them have really intriguing capabilities, but I think it is obvious that there is a big gap between what we as human beings can achieve in terms of consciousness in comparison to what animals can do. If you think of a cultural institution such as the university, for example, or the opera, or whatsoever. Okay. So, evolution is certainly a strong motivator for change, for learning. However, that is on a very high level, and it doesn't explain anything about the individual beyond sheer capacity. So it's providing capacity. Okay. What we have on the other side is growing up and growth of the brain. Of the central nervous system. These are two aspects that are, of course, linked to each other, but still distinguishable, of course. When it comes to growth, then it means that neurons have to connect somehow. We said that when we spoke about the neuron in media and brain 1. It is one of the intriguing capabilities that apparently knowledge is stored in the connection points between two neurons. It is also stored in the type of neurotransmitter that is used, in the fact that something is inhibitory or excitatory. It is stored in the thresholds for the activation, in the way the signal propagation happens. And very little, unfortunately, do we know how these aspects of the topology in the brain are actually formed. One thing is certain today, that neurons connect when they are firing together. The details can be read in the course literature as expected for the seminar task, but the basic principle is that the neurotransmitters that are propagated from one synapse to another and the electrical signal that is propagated over the axon change the surface of the neural cell, making it more sensitive and thus guiding other neurons in proximity, close to this one, to connect to it again. If we have a few hundred connections, we can speak of actually an information merging between the two cells. And it is well understood that this happens when we have connections that are, when we have neurons that are firing together. That is very much in line with what we said in the blog on deep learning, that we can actually not unlearn anything because this is a directed process. Firing together means firing at the same time, propagating the signal forward over the activation potential at the same time. It cannot be reversed. If it cannot be reversed, then we can actually lose connection only by them dying off, by starvation, or by strengthening connections that make these obsolete. So deviation from one pathway, from one processing path towards another for the unlearning side of the growth problem. Two terms then in that context one should be aware of are habituation versus sensitization. The former in the context of, for example, reflexes, fast, fragile connections. The latter is the typical case that we have been speaking about, where you form connection after connection until a semantic link between two concepts is actually established. Okay, so what can we learn from growing up? One thing for sure we can take is that there are typical paths for learning certain capabilities. One of them, for example, being language learning, where at a certain age you should have a certain vocabulary, should be able to pronounce words with one syllable, two syllables, have a vocabulary of 50 words and develop that over time. Another one is the visual system, where we have to learn the colors, to distinguish the colors and the different shapes. Also after time, that comes with growing up, with age. There are certain paths for learning the colors blue, red, green and yellow, for being able to contrast them and so on. So apparently there is a bootstrap algorithm in the brain, which might be DNA encoded or not, I don't know, but it is certainly there. It is quite similar for most of us, therefore it might have something to do with our DNA, and that on the low syntactic level is the same for all of us. What is very different for us is our potential, our, as I would say, call it creativity, and sometimes, of course, very often referred to as the IQ. So the ability to process information, the amount of information, quickness to establish links on higher levels, and so on. That is, to a degree, certainly built in. To another degree, I think it has a lot to do with reflection and with keeping training your algorithm and your processing unit in order to make it stronger. So like as you build up muscles in the fitness center, you might also build up your mental capacity, which is supported by findings on certain degradations and illnesses, which for Alzheimer and dementia, which affect people less if they challenge their brain by constant training. Okay, a third aspect that has to be mentioned here is puberty. which is a very, very spectacular phase in the development of the human being. And it means that centers that have grown to very high density, I'm not speaking of the cerebellum here, but of areas in the cortex, are actually reduced in their density. Neurons and neural connections die off in that period of life, whereas in other areas the same functions are learned again or transferred actually, meaning that through a process of reflection, of restructuring, the brain becomes more uniformly populated than it was before puberty. That is a shift of information. It is also a re-evaluation of information that has, as many scientists agree, the purpose of providing the basis for long-term usage of the brain. If you're interested in that, there are very intriguing videos on brain scans during puberty on YouTube, and there you can see that really large areas are depopulated, and it is assumed that up to 1/4, 25% of all neural connections die at the age of puberty. That is certainly a learning process after a field has been created and a lot has been stored in the child years, that through this restructuring, through this semi-automatic mechanical reflection process, information is distributed more widely, such as the memory forgetting function in the LSTM redistributes the information in every single cell and making it more complex to use. Okay, so this is another aspect that should not be forgotten here. Okay. Yeah, that's about it. In the center of all that stands the development of one thing, which is awareness. So the goal of becoming what we are is to enable this awareness, which is closely linked to consciousness. In most theories, it is seen as the central building block next to the memory of what actual consciousness is. It is, given what we already have, certainly based on the evolutionary development of the cortex, of the bigger, denser, and more sophisticated brain. It couldn't be otherwise, I believe. It is created by learning that cannot be unlearned, but requires the learning of opposite complementary patterns in order to keep a sane perception of the outside world. And the process in which that happens, growing up, has its automatic bootstrap components. It has its dramatic restructuring process, so like a crisis in which actually the whole store is refurbished and recreated, and thus creates the preliminaries for becoming what we actually are, for developing a character and becoming aware of ourselves. Yeah, that's it in this block. Thank you very much.